Hello, Bharat Aluminium Company Ltd, BALCO, Campus Interview Preparation. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into preparation guides for BALCO campus and off-campus interviews. All these are expected questions which may be asked in interview. Before moving further, little brief about BALCO. Bharat Aluminium Company Ltd, BALCO, is one of India's leading aluminium producers, known for its large-scale, fully integrated operations from mining to finished metal. The company is part of the Vedanta Group and plays a major role in supplying aluminium to key sectors like power, automotive, construction, and consumer goods. Let's begin. How would you evaluate the cost efficiency of an integrated aluminium producer across mining, refining, smelting, and power generation? Sample answer. I start by analyzing cost per ton at each stage of the value chain. Mining cost per ton of bauxite, refining conversion cost for alumina, smelting cost per ton of metal, and power cost per megawatt hour. I compare actual costs with benchmarks and internal budgets. Aluminium value chains are energy heavy, so power efficiency plays a major role. I also examine equipment utilization, specific energy consumption, and contractor costs. In answer, one should always include points like reviewing stage-wise cost drivers, benchmarking, and analyzing power efficiency. What steps will you take to analyze the financial impact of fluctuations in global aluminium prices on BALCO's profitability? Sample answer. I evaluate sensitivity of EBITDA and margins to changes in LME prices. I analyze forward sales, hedges, and premium structures like MJP or MJP-linked premiums. Then I check cost absorption and whether cost per ton changes with volumes. Price volatility directly affects BALCO's smelter earnings, so understanding exposure is essential. In answer, one should always include points like performing sensitivity analysis, reviewing hedges, and testing margin impact. Scenario. You observe a significant variance between planned and actual production at the smelter unit. How would you investigate the reason? Sample answer. I review potline availability, equipment downtime, and technical KPIs like current efficiency or metal tapping frequency. Then I check material availability, especially alumina, pitch, and power stability. I compare manpower deployment and any unplanned outages. Production variance in smelting usually points to operational interruptions. In answer, one should always include points like checking potline stability, reviewing power quality, and analyzing material constraints. How do you assess internal controls in large-scale mining operations with heavy contractor dependency? Sample answer. I evaluate contractor onboarding, shift-wise attendance tracking, and output-linked payments. I review weighbridge controls, fuel consumption norms, and ore grade sampling. Mining areas depend on physical supervision, so strong field controls and GPS monitoring matter. In answer, one should always include points like reviewing weighbridge controls, validating contractor billing, and checking physical monitoring. What procedures would you follow to verify correctness of power cost allocation between captive power units and smelting operations? Sample answer. I examine metering systems, power dispatch registers, and consumption logs for each potline. I verify the tariff structure used for internal allocation, including variable and fixed components. Power is the largest cost for aluminium, so allocation must be precise. In answer, one should always include points like checking meters, validating allocation logic, and reconciling consumption. Scenario. Coal consumption per ton of aluminium spikes unexpectedly. What analyses would you perform? Sample answer. I check coal GCV, blending ratios, boiler efficiency, and ash generation. I verify whether coal quality changed or whether power plant equipment had efficiency losses. I also analyze any sudden load variations at the smelter that increased energy demand. In answer, one should always include points like analyzing coal quality, reviewing boiler efficiency, and checking smelter energy load. How would you evaluate the valuation of mining reserves and the impact on financial statements? Sample answer. I review geological studies, ore grade estimates, stripping ratios, and mine life assumptions. I check whether reserve valuation impacts asset depreciation and mine restoration provisions. Reserve changes directly affect long-term asset values. In answer, one should always include points like validating geological data, reviewing mine life assumptions, and assessing accounting impact. And what checks do you perform to audit inventory valuation for bauxite, alumina, and finished aluminium products? Sample answer. I test quantity controls through stock registers, weighbridge reports, and physical verification. For valuation, I validate cost sheets, overhead absorption, and net realizable value. The aluminium chain involves multiple conversion stages, so accuracy matters. In answer, one should always include points like checking quantities, validating costing, and verifying NRV. Scenario. You notice discrepancies between dispatch records and SAP inventory reports. How do you handle it? Sample answer. I start by reconciling truck-wise dispatch data with SAP movement records. I check for delayed postings, system errors, or manual overrides. If gaps persist, I verify gate passes, weighbridge slips, and logistics acknowledgements. In answer, one should always include points like reconciling records, checking system postings, and validating physical documents. Underscore. That answer provides an incentive for growth and competency in working together. If you have questions about dispatches in salaries and valuations and team compensation, growth finding can be applied in the two provided S programs. If you have raised Bernan and Fanner, also growth finding can be applied in the context of salaries and wages and compensation. If you have a long-term work plan in place, experience growth for factory and concentrating efforts in answers where internal documents. Verify gate passes, weighbridge slips, and logistics acknowledgements. In answer, one should always include points like reconciling records, checking system postings, and validating physical documents. In answer, one should always include points like reconciling records, checking system postings, and validating physical documents. In answer, one should always include points like reconciling records, checking system postings, and validating physical documents. In answer, one should always include points like reconciling records, checking system postings, and validating physical documents. In answer, one should always include points like reconciling records, checking system postings, and validating physical documents. In answer, one should always include points like reconciling records. How do you evaluate the effectiveness of environmental compliance mechanisms in a highly regulated industry like aluminium? Sample answer. I review emissions monitoring data, effluent treatment records, hazardous waste handling, and statutory filings. I also check internal audits, pollution control board inspections, and compliance with consent conditions. Environmental lapses can cause shutdowns, so controls must be robust. In answer, one should always include points like reviewing pollution records, checking statutory compliance, and assessing risk of violations. What procedures do you follow to review large capex projects like potline expansion or power plant upgrades? Sample answer. I analyze project cost approvals, vendor selection, contract terms, and milestone-based payments. I check actual progress versus plan, capitalization criteria, and reasons for delays. Capex quality determines long-term cost competitiveness. In answer 1 should always include points like reviewing approvals, validating milestones, and analyzing delays. Scenario: a capex project is significantly delayed. What financial risks would you analyze? Sample answer: I examine cost overruns, interest during construction, potential impairment, and impact on production timelines. I also analyze whether delay affects regulatory approvals or long-term cost savings expected from the project. In answer 1 should always include points like reviewing cost overruns, analyzing IDC, and assessing impairment risk. How do you assess the efficiency of potline operations using KPIs like current efficiency and specific energy consumption? Sample answer: I compare actual KPIs with design benchmarks. I analyze anode effect frequency, heat balance, and pot health reports. Potline behavior is highly sensitive, so even small deviations affect cost per ton. In answer 1 should always include points like analyzing KPIs, checking deviations, and reviewing pot health. What steps would you take to validate internal transfer pricing among mining, refining, and smelting units? Sample answer: I review cost sheets, transfer price methodologies, and arm's length assumptions. I check whether transfer prices reflect market rates or regulatory guidelines. Internal pricing impacts segment profitability and performance evaluation. In answer 1 should always include points like validating cost structures, reviewing methodology, and checking fairness. End. Scenario: you find unusual fluctuations in alumina conversion cost. How would you investigate? Sample answer: I analyze caustic soda usage, energy consumption, bauxite quality, and steam cost. I also check equipment downtime or operational inefficiencies. Alumina conversion cost depends heavily on raw material chemistry and energy balance. In answer 1 should always include points like checking chemical inputs, reviewing energy use, and analyzing downtime. How do you review compliance with Mines Act, environmental laws, and safety norms from a finance or audit standpoint? Sample answer: I test documentation of statutory inspections, training records, accident logs, and adherence to operating permissions. I verify that compliance costs and penalties are accurately recorded. Mining operations need strict monitoring to avoid legal exposure. In answer 1 should always include points like reviewing statutory records, validating filings, and analyzing safety gaps. What checks do you perform while auditing long-term fuel supply agreements like coal linkages or renewable PPAs? Sample answer: I examine contract terms, pricing formulas, escalation clauses, and minimum offtake obligations. I review supply consistency, quality standards, and reconciliation of delivered quantities. Long-term energy contracts shape cost stability. In answer 1 should always include points like checking contract clauses, validating supply records, and analyzing quality. Scenario: coal inventory differs significantly from physical verification. What is your next step? Sample answer: I verify weighbridge reports, consumption logs, and received versus recorded quantities. I check whether moisture loss, pilferage, or measurement errors contributed to the gap. If mismatch is material, I escalate for investigation and correction. In answer 1 should always include points like reconciling receipts, analyzing consumption, and checking physical issues. Then, how do you evaluate hedging strategies used to mitigate commodity and forex risks? Sample answer: I examine hedge instruments, coverage ratios, and alignment with underlying exposures. I check hedge effectiveness through retrospective and prospective testing. I analyze whether hedges reduce earnings volatility as intended. In answer 1 should always include points like reviewing exposures, testing effectiveness, and validating hedge logic. What procedures do you follow to audit vendor contracts in mining, logistics, and power supply? Sample answer: I review scope of work, rate structures, penalty clauses, and performance benchmarks. I validate build quantities with operational data. I examine contract renewals and any deviations from tender terms. Vendor contracts heavily influence mining cost behavior. In answer, one should always include points like reviewing contract terms, validating build quantities, and checking compliance. Scenario: freight expenses increase disproportionately compared to production levels. How do you analyze this? Sample answer: I first compare freight cost per ton with previous periods to see if the increase is linked to rate changes or volume mix. Then I review route-wise logistics data, contract rates with transporters, and diesel price impacts. I also check whether dispatch patterns changed, for example, more long-distance customers or partial truckloads. If mismatch persists, I verify whether any operational inefficiencies or billing errors occurred. In answer, one should always include points like analyzing freight per ton, reviewing contracts, and checking route or mix changes. How do you assess operational efficiency in mining using KPIs such as stripping ratio, ore recovery, and haulage cost? Sample answer: I compare each KPI with geological plans and budgeted norms. A rising stripping ratio indicates more overburden removal, so cost increases must be justified by mine plan adjustments. Low ore recovery may point to poor blasting or loading practices. I analyze haulage cost per ton kilometer to detect inefficiencies in fleet deployment. In answer, one should always include points like benchmarking KPIs, analyzing deviations, and assessing operational practices. What checks do you perform to review the accuracy of employee cost allocation in a large manufacturing setup? Sample answer: I evaluate timesheet processes, cost center mapping, and allocation keys used for production and support departments. I validate payroll data, overtime logic, and on-roll versus contractor mix. Employee cost must reflect actual usage of labor across mining, refining, smelting, and power units. In answer, one should always include points like validating allocation drivers, reconciling payroll, and checking cost center accuracy. ... Scenario: contractor billing increases sharply despite stagnant production. How do you evaluate this? Sample answer: I first compare build quantities with actual output and equipment logs. Then I review contract terms for rate changes, minimum guarantee clauses, or manpower deployment differences. I also check for idle charges or standby billing. A sudden increase usually indicates inefficiency or incorrect billing. In answer, one should always include points like reconciling output with bills, reviewing contract clauses, and analyzing idle charges. How do you analyze the working capital cycle for a metals and mining enterprise? Sample answer: I evaluate receivable days, inventory days for bauxite, alumina, and metal, and payable days to major suppliers. I analyze cycle trends with changes in production, dispatch, or commodity prices. Working capital is highly sensitive to alumina and metal price movements. In answer, one should always include points like analyzing receivable cycles, testing inventory trends, and reviewing payables. What procedures would you follow to evaluate BALCO's sustainability and ESG reporting? Sample answer: I review disclosures on emissions, waste handling, water usage, safety indicators, and community development. I test whether data is traceable to internal systems. Aluminium companies face high ESG scrutiny, so completeness and accuracy are essential. In answer, one should always include points like validating environmental data, checking traceability and reviewing disclosure quality. 1. Scenario: a sustainability audit highlights repeated non-compliance in waste disposal. How would you escalate it? Sample answer: I verify the findings by reviewing waste logs, disposal receipts, and environmental sampling reports. Then I report the repeated non-compliance to senior management and the Sustainability Committee. If risks are serious, I recommend immediate corrective actions and potential regulatory reporting. In answer, one should always include points like verifying evidence, escalating early, and recommending corrective measures. How do you assess risks associated with captive power operations, especially related to coal quality and availability? Sample answer: I analyze coal GCZ trends, supplier reliability, blending ratios, and boiler performance. I review stock levels, wagon availability, and linkage agreement compliance. Power operations are central to aluminium production, so fuel risk is a major factor. In answer, one should always include points like analyzing coal quality, reviewing supply reliability, and testing performance data. What checks do you perform when auditing shutdown and maintenance expenditure for smelters or power plants? Sample answer: I review approved shutdown plans, contractor quotes, and scope of work. I verify whether actual activities match planned maintenance. I reconcile material consumption, spares, and labor hours. Shutdown expenses must be both necessary and controlled. In answer, one should always include points like checking shutdown plans, verifying invoices, and reconciling material use. Scenario: a potline unexpectedly fails, impacting production. What financial assessments would you conduct? Sample answer: I evaluate production loss, incremental power consumption, repair cost, and whether the event triggers impairment. I also assess impact on order commitments and working capital. Potline outages can materially change cost per ton. In answer, one should always include points like quantifying production loss, analyzing repair cost, and assessing impairment triggers. How do you evaluate the accuracy of cost drivers across the aluminium value chain? Sample answer: I review standard cost sheets for mining, refining, and smelting. I validate usage norms for caustic soda, pitch, cryolite, power consumption, and labor. I compare variances with physical performance data. Accurate cost drivers ensure reliable MIS. In answer, one should always include points like validating usage norms, reconciling physical data, and analyzing variances. What procedures would you follow to review procurement controls for alumina, pitch, cryolite, and other raw materials? Sample answer: I review vendor selection, tendering, price benchmarks, and approval workflows. I verify received quantities through weighbridge and quality reports. Procurement of critical materials must be transparent, competitive, and quality-focused. In answer, one should always include points like checking tender processes, validating quantities, and matching quality certificates. End. Scenario: a significant deviation appears between landed cost and purchase order cost of imported raw materials. How do you examine this? Sample answer: I compare shipping documents, customs duty payments, insurance, port charges, warehousing, and exchange rate effects. I verify whether PO terms included or excluded certain cost elements. Landed cost deviations often rise from forex or logistics changes. In answer, one should always include points like reviewing logistics charges, checking forex impact, and tracing customs records. How do you assess Treasury operations for a capex-intensive company with long-term debt like BALCO? Sample answer: I review loan agreements, interest rates, hedging arrangements, and repayment schedules. I test accuracy of interest calculations and compliance with covenants. I analyze liquidity buffers to ensure large projects have stable funding. In answer, one should always include points like validating loan terms, reviewing hedges, and checking covenant compliance. What checks do you perform to validate compliance with Ind AS for asset capitalization, impairment, and provisions? Sample answer. I test capitalization criteria for capex, verify useful life assumptions, and check impairment indicators like falling LME prices or lower utilization. I validate provisions for mine closure, employee benefits, and legal cases. Ind AS compliance ensures accurate financial reporting. In answer, one should always include points like testing compliance, reviewing assumptions, and validating disclosures. Scenario: indicators of impairment arise for a smelter unit due to falling LME prices. How do you proceed? Sample answer. I test recoverable value using value in use or fair value models. I verify assumptions like metal prices, discount rates, and production efficiency. If recoverable value is below carrying amount, an impairment is required. In answer, one should always include points like evaluating recoverable value, reviewing assumptions, and checking carrying amounts. How do you evaluate internal audit effectiveness across mining, refining, smelting, and power units? Sample answer. I review internal audit coverage, findings closure rate, audit frequency, and depth of process testing. I check whether key risks like safety, environment, and energy use are adequately covered. Internal audit must work as a proactive risk partner. In answer, one should always include points like assessing coverage, checking closure rates, and reviewing risk focus. What steps would you take to analyze the reliability of production planning and forecasting systems? Sample answer. I compare forecast accuracy with actual production, evaluating variance drivers. I review data inputs like ore quality, power availability, and potline stability. Weak forecasting disrupts budgeting and inventory planning. In answer, one should always include points like checking forecast accuracy, analyzing assumptions, and reviewing system reliability. Scenario: a material inconsistency arises between energy meters and power consumption recorded in accounts. What do you check? Sample answer. I review meter calibration reports, meter-to-panel wiring, and data transfer logs. I check whether technical losses or auxiliary consumption were incorrectly recorded. If mismatch persists, I involve the electrical and SAP teams for root cause analysis. In answer, one should always include points like checking calibration, analyzing technical losses, and validating system data. Ending parentheses. How do you assess adequacy of safety-related provisions and statutory liabilities? Sample answer. I review accident records, mine safety audit findings, and regulatory inspection reports. I verify whether provisions reflect actual risk exposure, including compensation, medical cost, and compliance penalties. Safety lapses can lead to major liabilities. In AXER, one should always include points like reviewing historical data, checking statutory requirements, and validating risk exposure. Thank you for watching, and if you liked our video, kindly press the like button and leave us a comment. This will help us reach a wider audience.